Ready? Okay. All right. Thank you all for coming tonight. I appreciate it. I don't know if I should start. Okay, so if you were at Ladies' Day, the slides won't be absolutely identical, so there will be some fresh stuff in there, so maybe a little surprise for you. But before I begin, I do want to preface by saying, and again, I'm sort of speaking to potentially new folks that might be watching this later, that I am not an expert on this stuff. I am not an expert on science, and I am certainly not an expert on Christian theology either. As far as my background, I spent almost 20 years in the Air Force, retired. I have a BA in social sciences, a Bachelor of Science in natural sciences, and I'm currently enrolled in Regent University School of Divinity, pursuing a Master of Arts in Apologetics and Cosmogony. I am a stay-at-home mom to 3 boys, and I manage our 30-acre farm and about 100 animals that live on it. So again, I'm not an expert on this stuff. I wish I could devote more time to studying both the Bible and science, but it's sort of just a part-time hobby of mine. So bear with me if I don't get down super into the weeds on things. The other thing I'd like to mention first is that I'm going to be talking about some old ages, the Earth being millions of years old. And my intention is not to turn this into potentially an age of Earth debate or anything like that. I simply want to teach you guys the language that the atheists are speaking so that you can talk to them. And the only way I can really do that, especially talking about evolution, it's really hard to talk about what the evolutionists are saying if I'm not telling you about some of these long periods of time. So again, it's not meant to offend anybody, it's just simply to present you with the science. And then lastly, before I begin, I just want to share my experiences. I am a new Christian. My husband and I were baptized on December 18th, 2019. And I think my journey to God is a little bit different than others in that I always knew that there was something bigger growing up throughout life, something more profound than myself. And I tried finding the answers for life's big questions by turning to science. And I never found the answers that I was looking for. And in fact, the more I discovered about science, the more I came to realize that all of what we are and what we see did not happen by accident. So for me, science brought me to God. And so I think that's why I feel just so compelled and called to share this information with you, because I think there is a lot of misconception that the Bible and science cannot be compatible, and that's not true at all, and we'll see that. And I think there's also the idea, particularly amongst atheists and skeptics, that Christians were a closed-minded bunch, we're intellectually deficient, we are weak, which is why we need God. And that's simply not the case. And so if you guys are equipped with some of this science, you can have some really good, logical, sound, rational conversations with atheists and skeptics too. So that's sort of my hope in all of this. All right. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So here in the very first words of the Bible, we have the beginning of the creation story. And the very first words on our natural world. And if we continue reading through Genesis, and in fact the rest of the Bible, we're going to come across lots of verses about creation and lots of verses that actually refer to the natural world and to science. But what does this mean, the relationship between God, the Bible, the natural world, and science? Are they compatible with one another? All right, it's my belief that they are. And Vern Poitras, he has a PhD in divinity and theology. He says, some people wonder how the Bible can instruct us given that it came from an ancient primitive culture that didn't know anything about modern science. But that's a mistake. God wrote the Bible in a way that expresses his full knowledge, but he also wrote it in a way that people who didn't know science could understand. He wasn't going to speak to them in a lot of jargon because that wasn't the point. The focus of the Bible is on redeeming us, not giving us a bunch of scientific information. And I think he hits the nail on the head there. That's the intent of the Bible, is not to tell us about, the formulas for the laws of gravity or things like that. It's to redeem us. But what's fascinating is that it's chock full of science. All right. If some of you remember last year, maybe a year and a half ago, when I gave a presentation for school, we talked about dual revelation a little bit. And I really love dual revelation. I know that there's some Christians that don't agree with this because they feel as though we are putting the interpretation of nature above God and God's word. But that's really actually not what dual revelation is. In fact, it was developed about 2,000 years ago by St. Augustine of Hippo. And it just describes the way in which God reveals himself to us. And so through his word, the book of scripture, the Bible, and through his works, the book of nature. Now, the book of nature is a metaphorical book, but it refers to everything around us, including us, everything that God made. Now, the book of scripture and nature are absolutely compatible because they're both inerrant. They were both created by God. It's when you get human beings involved into the interpretation that you get the problems. And so through human interpretation of the Bible, we get theology. Through human interpretation of the book of nature, we get science. And that's where the trouble comes in, right? It's kind of up to us to have that dialogue between the two. And it's definitely possible because it's all compatible with one another. Right here in Psalm chapter 19, we kind of see this idea of that nature reveals God just as much as his word does. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaim his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. So again, here we see directly from the Bible that nature absolutely reveals God. His fingerprints are on everything. And so before we get into some of the fine-tuning of our cosmos, I thought, there's a big misconception that there are no reputable scientists who are also Christians. And that is simply not the case. And in fact, a lot of the early influential scientists of the scientific revolution were Christians first and foremost. And so the first one here is Blaise Pascal. If you pick up any physics or chemistry book, you're likely to come across Blaise Pascal. So he was a theologian and philosopher. He was a mathematician and a physicist. He was the inventor of the mechanical calculator, the hydraulic press, and the syringe. And so although he lived a long time ago during the scientific revolution, his inventions and his discoveries are still being utilized today. But as I said, he was a Christian first and foremost. And he said, "There is a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every man which cannot be filled by any created thing, but only by God, the Creator, made known through Jesus." All right, another influential early scientist is Robert Boyle. Again, if you pick up any chemistry book, you're going to hear about Boyle's law. He was a theologian and philosopher, a physicist, and he's considered the first modern chemist. And again, he is responsible for Boyle's law, which is an important law that's still utilized throughout engineering and all sorts of, even aviation. So very influential. But again, he put God first. God, the author of the universe and the free establisher of the laws of motion. And so it's kind of refreshing. You see these scientists that are talking, these are the guys that are discovering these laws that we now take for granted. But to them, they gave all the credit to God. And it's sort of a shame that we've lost that in science. And then lastly, everybody knows who Isaac Newton is. He is a theologian, mathematician, physicist, and of course he formulated the laws of motion and gravity. And he said, "There is a being who made all things, who holds all things in his power and is therefore to be feared." He also went on to say, "All material things seem to have been composed of the hard and solid particles, variously associated in the first creation by the counsel of an intelligent agent. For it become him who created them to set them in order. And if he did so, it's unphilosophical to seek any other origin of the world, or to pretend that it might arise out of chaos by mere laws of nature." So here, Sir Isaac Newton believed that all of these laws and all of nature were created by God. And again, it's a shame that science has fell away from that. But it's interesting, we all hear about Isaac Newton in the textbooks. You know, I'm sure Jace will hear about him next year in first grade. You know, that story with the apple and all that. But what will not be told is that he was a Christian first and foremost. Okay, so now I'm going to get into some fine-tuning elements of the universe. And some of these slides will look familiar from my presentation from a year and a half ago. But really, I'm going to kind of get into the weeds on some of this, and my intention is not to just confuse everybody and bore you all to death. I really want to show you how intricately designed our universe is, down to the subatomic level. And so the first thing I want to talk about are the four universal forces. Now, these are forces that exist throughout the universe. They literally hold everything together, and they are really, really fine-tuned. Again, they exist throughout the universe. And the first one is the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, and then the gravitational force, which is actually the weakest of the two, but the one we're probably most familiar with. And so I'm not going to go into depth into all of these, but just know that each one is finely, finely tuned. And so if we just take a look at the strong nuclear force constant, it's actually what holds the nucleus of atoms together. So here's a picture of a helium atom. You can see the red are the protons and the yellow are the neutrons. If that strong nuclear force were any stronger or weaker, well, let me pull up the slide here. All right, if that force were any weaker, protons would never stick together. And so hydrogen would be the only element that would ever exist. So if you imagine these protons here not sticking together because that constant's too weak, the only thing you would have is a single proton in the nucleus, which is hydrogen. However, if that constant, the constant that's holding that nucleus together, was any stronger, then all you would have are heavy elements. All those protons and neutrons would be coming together. So you'd never have hydrogen, you'd never have helium. And though obviously hydrogen is absolutely necessary for life because it's part of the water molecule. So you can see how even at an atomic level, we have such extreme fine tuning. In fact, it must be just right in order for everything in the universe to exist, not just us. And so if we look quickly just at the other four, I won't go through these, but you can just see that each one has sort of a threshold. If it's just weaker or stronger by just a little bit, you can see that we wouldn't have a lot of the elements that are necessary for life and for planet formation and star formation. Right? So even though these are forces that we can't see, they're still highly, highly fine-tuned. All right, I'm just going to kind of go through this one quickly as well. Whoops, let me go back. All right, so the mass of a neutron. And so inside the nucleus, we've got the positively charged particles, which are the protons, and the little green guys here, which don't have any charge, those are neutrons. Well, the mass of a neutron actually matters. It's finely tuned. And so neutrons, they end up requiring more energy to make than protons. But what if they were just 0.1% weaker? Well, we would have no heavy elements such as carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and on down the periodic table, which are all life essential elements. If the mass of a neutron was just 0.1% stronger, we would have too many protons flying around in the universe, and that would cause stars to burn too quickly and to turn into black holes. And so obviously life is not going to exist in either of those environments. And so the mass of a neutron, this thing that we can't even see, has to be just right. All right, so fine-tuned down to 0.1%. Okay, dark energy density. This one's kind of crazy. So dark energy was discovered in 2003. Scientists believe that it is actually the repulsive force that is sort of stretching out our universe from its original creation. Again, it causes the universe to expand. And so if that expansion were too rapid, matter would disperse before it ever had a chance to clump together to form the stars and the planets. If it were too slow, all matter in the universe, it would spread out and then, like a rubber band, collapse back together into a hyperdense ball of mass before star formation or planet formation ever occurs. And so the dark energy density, that force that stretches out our universe, is highly, highly fine-tuned. In fact, Lawrence Krauss, he's an astronomer and he's an atheist. He said that dark energy density is the most extreme fine-tuning yet discovered in the universe. In fact, it is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 122nd power. That's a 1 with 122 zeros behind it. So if you change just 1 part in that dark energy density constant, the universe would not exist. And here you have an atheist and a well-respected physicist saying it's the most highly fine-tuned thing that we have in the universe, which is pretty remarkable. That's a number that really, even looking up there, I really can't even wrap my brain around it. It's such a big number. And so what I find interesting, as I've read through the Bible, there are a lot of verses that talk about the stretching out of the heavens. Now, I don't know that the original writer was specifically talking about our universe actually stretching out, but I think that it's interesting that that's the terminology that science says. They say it's stretching out and expanding. And it's interesting how we see kind of a concordance with the Bible with that too. And so in Job, we see he alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. In Psalm, you are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent. Thus says God, the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it. And that's in Isaiah. And so it's really interesting to sort of see, to me, that kind of puzzle piece fit together there. And again, I don't know that the original writers, that was their intention, but that's certainly what science is telling us is happening. Okay, so kind of going from the big cosmic level down a notch to the galaxy level. Now, you wouldn't think that the galaxy cluster that we live in would really matter that much, but it does. And so our particular galaxy cluster is creatively called the local group. It's the best they could come up with for that. But it's comprised of our galaxy, the Milky Way, Andromeda Galaxy, which is 3 million light years away, and then about 100 little dwarf galaxies in there too. And so why does the cluster matter? Well, if it were too dense, here's an artist's representation of 2 galaxies colliding. You could imagine life would not really exist long in that situation. And so if it's too dense, the gravitational forces of those galaxies would pull it all together and disrupt any planetary systems. If it were too sparse, you wouldn't have enough infusion of the really important gases that are needed to kickstart star formation. Without stars, you don't have planets. Without planets, you don't have life. And so even our little neighborhood of the universe and our local galaxy group is important. So what about galaxy type? So this little yellow dot at the bottom sort of represents our location in the galaxy. We're kind of way far out on an outward spiral. But the type of galaxy that we live in determines whether or not life is going to exist. And so science tells us that in order for life to exist, a galaxy must be spiral as opposed to an irregular galaxy. It has to have nice, stable arms, and it has to have nice, well-separated arms. Unfortunately for us, the Milky Way fits all of those criteria. Now, astronomers estimate that only 6% of galaxies in the universe are spiral. And so that's interesting. Not all galaxies are capable of supporting life. All right, so coming down now to the solar system level. Here's a picture of our sun. It's our parent star. Our sun is a yellow dwarf, and so it's not too red, not too blue, and it's perfect for photosynthesis. And so for life to exist, a star has to be the just right color. Like I said, you have to have photosynthesis. It has to have the just right metallicity. It has to be the just right mass. And it has to be the just right distance from the center of the galaxy. And we're going to talk about the sun and some of its features in another presentation. But okay, so what about Jupiter? You may be surprised, but Jupiter's mass and distance determines whether or not we exist. Jupiter's pretty awesome. So let's just open all these up here. So if Jupiter were too small, or if it were too far away, Earth would be bombarded by more asteroid and comet collisions. And the reason scientists believe that is because Jupiter is so massive. It can fit all of the planets inside of it. So you have this huge, massive object, and it does a great job of using its gravity to pull in asteroids and comets, and it actually helps to protect us. If it were too large or too close, its huge gravity would completely disrupt the orbits of the other stars, including ours. And so obviously, if our orbit's disrupted, we're no longer in that sweet spot in relation to our sun, so life won't exist. So even Jupiter's mass and distance impacts whether or not life exists. And the same with Neptune. If Neptune were too small or too large, same thing would happen. If it were too small, well, first let me back up and say, on the outer rim of our solar system, just beyond Neptune, is what's called the Kuiper Belt. It's basically a big belt of debris and rocks, and a lot of asteroids and comets originate from there. And so Neptune does a really good job of sort of kicking those things back out of the solar system. And so if its mass were too small, potentially we could be bombarded by more comet and asteroids. And again, if it were too large, it could disrupt the other planets. And so we generally don't think of, when we talk about kind of the Goldilocks zone or a planet being habitable for life, we really take for granted the fact that the other planets and our moon and our star, all of that has to be just right. It's simply not about being the right distance from your star. There's so much more to it than that. Okay, so let's talk about the moon. The moon is necessary for life on Earth. Science believes that if the moon were just 2% more massive, it would destabilize Earth's rotational axis, which is what gives us our seasons. It would slow down Earth's rotation, which could cause all sorts of havoc, and our ocean tides would be far too great. If it were just 2% less massive, it would not slow down Earth's rotation rate. And I just want to mention, scientists believe that early Earth rotated really, really quickly, and that the moon helped slow that down. It also would cause inadequate ocean tides if it were too small. So even our moon makes it possible for life to exist. And one thing I did not talk about last year that is just fascinating to me are solar eclipses. Now, this isn't so much, evidence that proves that life can exist somewhere, but it's more of evidence that this is all created for our benefit and our enjoyment. And so solar eclipses, we had one a couple of years ago, but it occurs when the moon passes between the Earth and the sun, and it blocks out the sun. Now, if you were fortunate enough to go to Oregon, was it 4 or 5 years ago, I think, when we had that one, you were able to see totality. So the sun was completely blocked out by the moon. But what's fascinating is that Earth is the only place in the solar system where a perfect solar eclipse can occur. And that's because the sun is roughly 400 times the size of the moon, but it's also 400 times the distance from the moon. So that's a perfect ratio that allows us to view, let me go to the next slide. Here's a picture of a solar eclipse, and you can see all of those flares coming off. That's the corona of the sun. We would not be able to investigate that or see that if it weren't for the moon perfectly fitting over the sphere of the sun. It's a perfect sun to moon ratio. I mean, that to me is just mind-blowing. Now, does that perfect ratio dictate whether life exists? No, but again, I think it's evidence that this was all created for our enjoyment and our exploration. So I came across an article in universetoday.com. They called it an amazing coincidence. And I just kind of chuckled because I feel like sometimes they'll just hang on to just anything if it means not giving God the credit for it. But again, I don't view it as a coincidence at all. That is just so miraculously fine-tuned. And so the Goldilocks Zone, and we're kind of getting to the end. I see sleepy eyes, so it's almost the end of the slide. You've all probably heard of the Goldilocks Zone, right? It's generally where they talk about that sweet spot where a planet is just a right distance from its host star. Well, there's so much more than that. All right, so here's kind of a picture of it. So that green band, that would be the sweet spot, the Goldilocks Zone. And for a long time, we used to think that was the only requirement necessary for life to exist. As long as you were just a certain distance from your sun, you're good to go. And that's not the case. In fact, as of today, now I will say, a year and a half ago when I did this presentation, I had this slide up, but there was only 9 requirements. So in the span of a year and a half, we've discovered 2 more requirements. And I would forecast that if I did this again in another year and a half, there'd probably be more. And so I won't go through all of these, but what these zones are, so for example, the first one, the liquid water habitable zone. If you think that life is going to exist on a planet, that planet has to have liquid water, right? And so if we go down through all of these elements here, these are just all the different criteria that have to be in place for life to exist. It's not simply being the right distance from your star. And the important thing to remember is that just residing in one of these zones is not enough. A planet has to reside in all 11 of these zones simultaneously for life to exist. So that still doesn't answer the question of how special Earth is, because if you talk to an atheist, chances are they're going to say, you know what, Earth isn't special, we're not special. But the scientific data is kind of telling us otherwise, in my opinion. All right, so exoplanets. As of the 16th of this month, there have been just over 4,400 exoplanets discovered. These are planets residing outside of our solar system. Of those planets, they have discovered that they are within about 3,200 different planetary systems. So that means you have a planet and a host star. Approximately 780 of those systems contain more than one planet. Now, if you remember when I was talking about Jupiter and Neptune's mass and how it was so important for life to exist, well, I'm not a scientist, but if you have a star and a single planet, I find it highly unlikely that life would exist there without other planets in the solar system. And so this number tells us that the majority of exoplanets we're discovering are not in planetary systems. And the really important thing to take away is that not one of those exoplanets that have been discovered or the planetary systems exhibit the identical characteristics of our solar system, our sun, or of Earth. There's only one planet they found that can inhabit life, and we're on it. Now, I've gotten into conversations before with atheists and some that have studied philosophy. That can be fun. I did have a conversation last year as part of an assignment for school. The person I was talking to had some training in philosophy, and he said, you know what, there's an infinite number of stars in the universe. Therefore, there's got to be life elsewhere. Well, I wanted to point out really quickly to him, and this is something that you should point out too, because you're probably going to hear it, that is not factual. There's not an infinite number of anything in our universe. There's a finite number of stars, a finite number of galaxies, and even a finite number of protons in our universe. And I think it's an important distinction to make, because people will throw out, well, there's an infinite number. Well, if you want to be technical, because you know they'd be technical if it were flipped, right? If you want to be technical, there's not. There's a finite number. Now, science currently says, and there's lots of different ranges. I'm being very generous to secular science here. 10% of all galaxies might be suitable. I've seen that number as low as 3 and as high as 10. So again, I'm being generous here. And then as far as stars, they've said that 10% of stars are likely yellow dwarfs, which is what our sun is and which is required for life. Again, I'm being generous. I've seen as low as 3% on that one as well. And so there's not a finite number of stars and galaxies and planets. And even more than that, science itself is telling us that very few of what exists potentially has life. And so I think that's really important to address that if somebody comes at you with sort of those grand numbers, like that's not accurate. If we're gonna have a conversation here, we need to be accurate with what we're talking about. And so my point to that is that I personally believe this is the only place life exists. I don't think life exists elsewhere. And as we go through some of the other slides and talk about the probability that life even exists here, perhaps you will come to the same conclusion. All right, so Dr. Hugh Ross, he has a ministry called Reasons to Believe. He is an astronomer, and he primarily, first and foremost, is a Christian. And he quotes that, thus it appears that the more we learn about exosolar planets or exoplanets, the more evidence we uncover that we live in a planetary system uniquely designed to provide us with a good habitat. And so I think that's a really profound statement. And then the last thing I want to point out, because I forgot, we had some friends over a couple years ago, and we were just sitting around the dinner table, just talking about all sorts of stuff. And she pulled up a picture on her phone, and it had a really beautiful picture of an exoplanet. And she said, look, they found an Earth, another Earth. And I said, well, I hate to tell you, but these are artist renditions. And so they'll put these really pretty pictures in articles and stuff because, you know, it's catchy. But it's important to know we don't know what any of these exoplanets look like. If you actually look at the pictures we have, it's almost like looking at an ultrasound, right? Like, unless you're trained, you have no idea what's going on there. It's basically a little black blip, maybe some, white coming off of it. So these are artist pictures. So if you see these, don't get confused or don't get misled. These are not close-up pictures because we don't have the technology to get there. I hate saying that, but it's amazing that, the way that they pitch it and the way that they word some of these articles, they almost say it as though it's fact. And so just keep that in mind, that these are just pictures from an artist. Okay, and so lastly, just want to close this presentation out. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? And so what is man that you are mindful of him? That's a pretty profound statement and so eloquently written. And I truly, truly believe that our cosmos was designed for our benefit. And hopefully, having gone through those slides, you can sort of see everything is so amazingly fine-tuned. And I only touched on a handful. There are literally hundreds upon hundreds of these parameters that have to be just right for us to exist. And that's that.